The disappearance of Reed Jeppson is the oldest active missing persons case in the state of Utah. Hi, I'm Shay, and this is the Evidence Locker. Reed Jeppson was born May 28, 1949, and if he's still alive, he would be in his 70s, although investigators doubt that's the case. There's actually no evidence to he survived past 1964, but let's not discount that possibility. Reed was born into a big family, which is typical for Utah if you know anything about it. He was one of 12 children. He was born to Edward and Elizabeth Jeppson. One of his siblings, Helen, did die as a baby, but despite this, they were a rather happy family. His oldest sibling, Patricia, was 29, and she was married and had kids of her own. His youngest sibling, Keith, was 7. Keith was almost exactly in the middle of all the siblings. Edward was a doctor, and he made good money and was able to give his kids a good, happy, and stable life, even with so many children. The Jeppson family lived on the east side of Salt Lake City in Utah. Edward built the house himself with his own hands at 1961 Browning Avenue, and they had a huge yard. I'm talking acres, where the kids would be able to spend their free time and roam. Reed loved playing football and was frequently outside with his neighbors, siblings, and friends. He was an all-around American kid. Aside from the family home in Salt Lake City, they also had a ranch in Montana, where they would spend a lot of times in the summer, so Reed had separate groups of friends in Montana and Utah. This is relevant later on. In addition to playing football, Reed loved dogs. He loved to train dogs to hunt birds, and at the time of his disappearance, Reed had 2 dogs that were entirely his responsibility. His parents had nothing to do with them and told Reed if he got them, he would be their sole caregiver. And his parents were actually very adamant about this, that the dogs went everywhere with him. So these 2 dogs were German Shepherd Pointers. He kept them in kennels in the yard, and they were large kennels, not like the small crates you keep inside. And one of them was a large adult dog, and one was a puppy. And this is also relevant later on. As I mentioned, the family lived in Salt Lake City. So, to many of you, it's probably no surprise that they were part of the Latter-day Saints community. Their life revolved around church, particularly on Sundays. They would spend hours at church. And on Sunday, October 12th, 1964, Reed wakes up and goes to a priesthood meeting with his brother John. That's what they did every Sunday. Reed and John were also called best friends. They shared a room and were always together. It was great having a brother as a best friend, according to John. So, Reed and John go to the priesthood meeting and come home for lunch just like they do every week. And they call it dinner in the reporting, and they call dinner supper, but I'm just going to call it lunch because that's what I know it as. So, they get home for lunch, and Susan, Reed's older sister, starts preparing lunch. And she sees Reed get some cans of dog food, and he says he's going to go to the kennel and feed the dogs, as he does every day. The kennels where they kept the dogs is about 150 to 200 yards away from the house. Like I said, they lived on acres. It was large property. So he was going to the kennels to feed his dogs. Suzanne tells him, "Don't take too long because lunch is going to be ready soon, and I don't want it to get cold." He says he'll be back quick, he's just going to feed the dogs, and he'll be back in no time. However, this is the last time Suzanne would ever see her younger brother. It appears that Reed might have also taken his dogs on a short walk as opposed to just feeding them and coming back for lunch like he told Suzanne he would. This is because a friend of Reed's later reported seeing him with the dogs near the St. Mary School, which was approximately a mile from the Jeppson home. And according to investigators, they believe that this sighting was him. When Reed didn't come back in from feeding his dogs, his family didn't really think anything of it. They thought he got carried away with training or took him on a walk without telling them. But then the afternoon passed and they were supposed to go back to church for Sunday school. And Reed was a very dedicated Latter-day Saints member. He wouldn't miss Sunday school on purpose, but he wasn't found anywhere at church. And then the 4 p.m. sacrament meeting, which he also didn't show up to, caused the family to grow more concerned. John, Reed's brother, and the brother he shared a room with, said he went to bed that night expecting to wake up in the morning for their paper route. He said he thought when he woke up, Reed would just be there in bed asleep, and he wasn't. John never saw Reed again. The last time Reed was seen, he was wearing a white cotton shirt, a reversible parka with one side black and one side blue, and blue jeans and sneakers. Reed is a white male with blonde hair, blue eyes, and he has braces on both his upper and lower teeth. At the time of his disappearance, he was 5'6" and approximately 150 pounds, and he was 15 years old, so he had a lot more growing and changing to do. That afternoon, Reed's family called everyone they could think of. All of his friends, his extended family, his friends even went out and searched for him, thinking maybe he had an accident with the dogs, maybe he got hurt. But then they turned to the police, and after about 12 hours, they were able to file an official missing persons report. And then the police took it seriously. An intensive search began, with investigators focusing on the foothills on the east side of the city, which is near the school and the Jeppson home. The captain of the search, Captain Seeloff, asked those walking in the foothills in this area to look out for unusual mounds of earth and piles of stone, as well as to check around fallen trees, clumps of shrub, and crevices. He basically asked people to help them out with the search and wanted people to look in areas where Reed may have gone missing or been hidden. Photos and descriptions of Reed were mailed to every single police department in Utah, even the smallest of towns. They were also sent to a majority of the surrounding states, such as Arizona and Nevada. And a lot of people were looking for Reed, but there was never a sign of him or either of the 2 dogs, and the dogs have always been a point of contention for the police. It's quite baffling to me that Reed has never been found, but also his dogs. German pointers are very loyal dogs. They wouldn't have just left him if he had an accident, especially how well trained these 2 were. But if someone were to do something to Reed, it would also be very hard to control him and the 2 dogs. What's really interesting is right after Reed went missing, the detectives seemed to focus in on John, Reed's brother. And it haunts him to this day that they were focusing on him instead of looking for Reed. In those early days, after Reed went missing, a detective was in their home and asked John if he'd like to come with him to talk to a neighbor about Reed's disappearance. John happily agreed to do so, thinking it would help his brother's case, and he hopped in the patrol car and they drove off together. Only the detective stopped the car in a random location, turned around, and looked at John. The detective said, "Okay, John, where is he?" John said he didn't know, he didn't have anything to do with Reed's disappearance. But the detective didn't believe him. He reiterated that he knew John knew where Reed was, and he was causing his parents immense heartache, and that he needed to stop playing games and tell the truth. John said the officer even threatened him with a polygraph test down at the station, which, keep in mind, were held to a much higher standard than today. Everyone used to believe that they were real. And he told John that he didn't believe him. John said he was furious at being accused and terrified. I mean, he was only a year or so older than Reed. He was 16. What child wouldn't be terrified? Not only was John terrified, he was upset. He knew that if the detective had confronted him, that meant his parents had given permission for it. John had never had any issues with his parents in his life, but he went home that day and confronted them. He was confused and upset his parents would even think he would have anything to do with his brother's disappearance. But his parents said their hands were tied, and the detective would come to them saying that they thought John might know something, and they just wanted Reed back. By November of that year, detectives were forced to admit there was no indication of foul play, but the family was insistent that Reed wouldn't just run away and leave everything behind. He had cash in his room. If he ran away, wouldn't he have taken that? He hadn't taken any clothing besides what he was wearing. And how would he run away with 2 dogs? The whole family struggled with Reed's disappearance, but it hit Edward, his father, particularly hard. He desperately missed Reed, and with all the rumors flying around that he was losing his good name, he convinced himself that the family would be better off without him. And a little over a year after Reed went missing, in December 1965, Edward Jeppson ended his own life, which, in my opinion, is a second victim of this case. Shortly after this, the case went cold. That is, until 2010. Reed's name actually came back to the attention of investigators in April of 2010 because human remains were found at Creek Canyon, which was only 6 miles from the Jeppson home. These remains were completely decomposed. It was only bones, and it was clear they'd been there for a long time. When the news of these remains broke, one of Reed's sisters, clearly still on the search of her brother all those years later, called the police and asked if they could possibly be the remains of Reed. The detective she spoke to had no clue what she was talking about. It wasn't in their computer system. He had never heard the name Reed Jeppson. He had to go into the physical archives where he eventually found a case file on Reed, as well as microfilm photos of the house and the surrounding areas. This case was so old that no living detectives remembered it. They had all retired or died. The detectives said they looked briefly into the possibility of these remains belonging to Reed, but it quickly became obvious that while the remains had been there a while, they hadn't been there for the over 4 decades that they should have been if they were Reed's. They ended up belonging to a man called Daniel, who went missing around September 1978 while hitchhiking. And just to clarify, it's not thought that anything nefarious happened to Daniel. He loved to hike, and it's believed something happened in the mountain that caused him to die, such as an accident, or maybe he just got sick. But it does show that even decades later, remains can be found and identified, and there's always hope that maybe Reed is still somewhere in the foothills. The Jeppson family had DNA collected from them and entered into the US's combined DNA index system that allows authorities to compare DNA profiles. The hope was that maybe Reed's remains had already been found somewhere else, and his DNA being entered in the system would find a match and they would finally be able to bring him home. Obviously, that didn't happen. With the renewed interest in Reed's case, media began reporting on it, and the police department received a call from a woman named Mary Jane, who lived in the house next door to the Jeppson's family home. It was actually in the process of being built when Reed went missing. Mary Jane said that she always knew about Reed's case, but one thing she didn't know was that he disappeared with 2 dogs. Reed's case coming back in the media, she heard about the dogs, and when she heard this, she became concerned. Because a couple of years before, her and her husband were doing some renovations in the yard, and in digging the yard up, they found 2 garbage bags that reeked. When they opened the bags, they found bones. Apparently, Mary Jane and the family just assumed that the bones were animal bones, and this was maybe somebody who buried the dead family dog in the garden. But they did call a local doctor to come over and confirm this, just to be safe. And they did confirm this was definitely dog bones. Mary Jane did say she actually took some photos of the contents of these bags just because she thought it was odd, but she didn't contact the police because you don't usually contact the police when you find dog bones. I mean, she didn't really think they'd be interested in them. So she threw the bones out with the rest of their trash, and it was taken away. She never thought much of it until years later, seeing in the news about Reed going missing with those 2 dogs. She knew Reed lived next door, and she knew that maybe this discovery might be of interest, so she contacted the police straight away. And luckily, the police did take her seriously. The photos of the bones were sent to an anthropologist who analyzed it, and they came to the conclusion that they were looking at the remains of 2 separate dogs, one large and one small. Reed's dogs were one adult and one puppy, so potentially that could be them. Obviously, just by looking at photos, there's no way to confirm exactly what breed of dog they were without DNA testing, but the anthropologist said he believed they could be German pointers. Reed's investigators contacted NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They had already created an age-progressed photo of Reed, but now they were providing ground-penetrating radar to search this garden. And very luckily for the police, Mary Jane already had an excavator at the house for some renovations that were ongoing. So they just used that. The homicide team spent a full day at the house with the radar and cadaver dogs, and they were just planning on digging as soon as the dogs alerted to something. However, they didn't find a trace of anything. And at the same time as the physical search, investigators are also taking a look at the man who lived in the house around the time of Reed's disappearance. So yes, the house was being built at the time of Reed's disappearance, but they were looking at the man who owned it and was having it built. That man was also coming around checking on the house time to time to see the progress and whatnot. And what they found out about this guy was that he had been accused of sexual assaults on multiple children, most of which were teenage boys around Reed's age. It appears, according to notes, that this neighbor was spoken to at the time that Reed went missing, but he was never really flagged as a person of interest. And you've got to remember, in the 60s, this neighbor was a doctor. He was held in very high regard in the community, so any accusations made against him would likely have been covered up pretty quickly or just not brought to attention at all. His assaults were also always kind of a grooming situation or an outright attack on the kids. He wasn't threatening them or holding a gun to their heads. He was slowly, over time, building a relationship with these teenagers and then slowly violating that trust. Also, in the 60s, if these teenagers came forward, they likely would have been blamed. And keep in mind, there was a lot more homophobic activity back then too. A man assaulting teenage boys, they would have been ostracized in society. Keep in mind, all of these assaults are alleged. None of the boys reported it to the police at the time. Mary Jane was the one who told the police rumors she'd heard when they moved into the house. Her son met a friend at church who he invited over for a sleepover. And when the dad came to pick up the son the next morning, him and Mary Jane got talking. And the dad said that he knew the previous owner and the home very well. And this was not good. The dad shared how he'd been violated, assaulted by the old owner as a young teenager. Now, the investigators couldn't just take Mary Jane at her word for this, so they did some digging. They found multiple other victims. Between 5 and 10, I couldn't find an exact number in my research, And there could easily be more out there that didn't want to come forward or admit it. And at least one of these victims had been paid off by the doctor at the time. And more recent suspected victims weren't willing to come forward and talk about their trauma. I mean, this dad had 40 years to process what had gone on. More recent victims didn't have that luxury. Sadly, despite the amount of allegations, the neighbor could not be arrested. Yes, he was a pedophile, but the statute of limitations had long passed. And in the 1960s, the statute of limitations was only 4 years. But because of all these allegations, investigators set up an interview with this neighbor, who was now officially a person of interest. Of course, he denied any involvement in the case. He denied knowing anything about it or the allegations against him. He said they were all made up. He did agree to take a voice stress test, which is similar to lie detector tests. They're more pseudoscience, if any science at all. But I will say he did fail it the first time. He asked to do it again and then passed it the second time. All in all, despite the allegations against him and his proximity to Reed's case, there's never been any concrete evidence against him. The neighbor has since died, and he would be very old if still alive today. Investigators have spent a lot of time interviewing his still living friends and family, building up a record of what he was like and what he was doing while they can still talk to these people. Sadly, it doesn't seem like the neighbor made any deathbed confessions to his family members, and while they didn't know about the assault allegations against him, according to detectives, they weren't really surprised. Although they did say that he was a good father, none of his own children ever made accusations against him. He said the neighbor's daughter at least seemed to maybe suspect that something had been going on. And interestingly enough, the neighbor's wife actually took her own life a while ago, and the reasons why are unknown. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of speculation. Some say she found out about the assault allegations and couldn't handle it. I mean, they looked at this angle as much as they could. You have a teenage boy go missing, who is the preferred age of the pedophile next door. You have to look into that. And they find dog bones in what used to be his backyard. But in the end, they had no evidence. They started and ended with the same amount. 0. They had nothing against him. The only thing I can add on about the neighbor is Mary Jane said that when she moved into the house, she was the second owner of the house. She bought it from the original owner, the neighbor, in these accusations. There was a very, quote, strange room in the downstairs of the house, which locked from the outside with these big locks. Apparently at first, Mary Jane didn't think anything of it, but knowing the context of the allegations against him, it's something that's questionable at least. Police did search this room, but they still found nothing. However, because of all this interest, there were big searches going on in the 2010s. They searched the foothills, the area surrounding his parents' acreage, and they dug on the Jeppson family's land, as well as around St. Mary's School. But still, they found nothing. There is obviously the chance that the neighbor has nothing to do with Reed's disappearance, and it's all a coincidence, and the police don't want to just focus on that one end. What if Reed is just lost somewhere in the woods? He fell, got hurt, and his dogs didn't want to abandon him, and they all died together. That is still a possibility the investigators are looking into. There are 3 possibilities when it comes to this case. The first being that Reed ran away. Originally, the detectives assume he ran away because that's what they always assume with missing teenagers. However, at this point, I believe he would have been found or come forward. Also, how do you run away with 2 dogs? Not only that, but he left all his cash and clothes behind. Initially, investigators believed he ran away to Montana, where, like I said, he had separate friends and a girl that he was apparently very interested in. They believed he ran away to be with her, but he never showed up there, and she was dating somebody else. The second theory is abduction, of course, particularly with the neighbor. One question is why take the dogs? But I suppose if the dogs wouldn't leave his side, you would have to take them with and obviously kill them and dispose of them as they would do with Reed. But that is my opinion, and in my opinion, it is the most likely theory. It could also be an abduction of opportunity or someone he knew, even. He could have been hitchhiking, he could have been hurt, and someone offered to help him. But I do believe if it was foul play, it was the neighbor. Like I said, this is all my opinion. The third theory is that Reed had an accident. Salt Lake City is surrounded by mountains, crevices. He could have fallen into a ditch while hiking. He could have tripped. He could have had any number of mishaps. And the German pointers likely wouldn't have left him alone. So maybe they all succumbed to the elements and just haven't been found yet. It has been over 50 years since Reed disappeared, and we have no more evidence today than we did the day he went missing. His family, however, is still hopeful that his body can be found and he can be laid to rest with his parents. If you or someone you know knows anything about Reed's disappearance, please contact the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. This has been the Episode Locker. This podcast is written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband, Toby. Stay curious, stay safe. Join us next week as we open another locker.